Before offering suggestions towards improving the playing of the Mendelssohn Concerto, I would like to take up a few moments regarding the work itself. The music, after all this century and more, is so immediately appealing and rewarding that it constitutes a favorite hunting ground and, once in a while, a graveyard of fiddlers from the age of 3 years upwards. A violinist needs a great deal of good solid foundation and understanding in every respect, naturally, before daring to attempt a work like this in public, although one can gain valuable experience in many ways from its thorough study. The heading, Allegro molto appassionato, does not imply that one should plunge into the very first notes with a feverish, impassioned energy. We think of 2 beats in a measure, that's true. The movement is marked alla breve, but that does not mean that we start in too speedily, and our very first notes themselves show us that a forced, hurried tempo is not the proper character of the beginning. What happens later on the page is an entirely different matter. The beginning must be alive, communicative, mellow, warm, pure, and singing, of course, but the climax of this page should be built up only little by little. Let's turn to the opening phrase. Now, of course, there are various ways of playing this opening phrase. One of the, prevalent ways, which is a rather cheap way, I think, is this. And another sort, which is just about as bad, is this. This latter one, I think, is a matter of safety first. We just slide till we reach the note we want to get to. But they're both in very bad taste, I think, since the original phrasing was this. I'm exaggerating a little bit to show the divisions between the low notes and the high notes. But when we come across additions which combine the whole measure like this, well, we know absolutely that they're wrong. The idea, too, behind those 5 quarter notes, here I mean, is that they should be very legato, not this way. That often happens. You hear people in public doing that all the time. 2 or 3 lines further along, we come across this. And then follows that chain of triplets. Did you notice I try very hard not to slide down from the high A? I think it's really a musical crime to do such a thing. The same as I would avoid at all costs a slide from B to F sharp here. You can hear yourselves how this sounds. I think it's a terribly weak sound. The triplets are generally played in a pretty uneven way and, unfortunately, very much out of tune. And the accents that come on the first and third beats don't help us any to try to secure that evenness we need. I'd suggest that we practice it this way. That, of course, is holding on to the offbeat note, just to sort of thwart nature, because nature is arranged that our second and third fingers sort of hang together, and it's very easy for this to happen. say nothing about the intonation. Incidentally, I believe this movement to be one of the most difficult in that respect, intonation I'm speaking of any concertos we have in the whole repertoire. And I can't lay too much stress on the fact that we should simply hear ourselves as others hear us when we practice, and endeavor to make a great difference between a whole tone and a half tone. In this very passage we're speaking about now, you notice that inconspicuous little half tone there? Well, how many times we hear it in public done in this fashion? It's sort of in between, we can't tell what it is. Of course, the same thing occurs the next time. Now, coming along in the next line, there's another high A. There again, I think it would be a catastrophe to slide down from a high A. I think it's a miserable sound. And incidentally, there's quite a good fingering. If we take our A, I'm taking for granted that we take it with the third finger. Then we take the next triplet, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then of course on down into the first position. Some printings of the concerto have this fingering. That's 3, 2, 1, 2. And I don't see how one can, to avoid something of that sort, even with the greatest left hand in the world. I think a 4, 3, 2, 1 guarantees a clean sound. Continuing on with the triplets, we come across this, starting on the G string. Now it's very easy there to produce this. Again, I'm not speaking of the intonation, that's quite a story in itself, but at least our triplets should be even. I would think that to achieve that, we should make the note which is too short too long. In other words, it'll be generally the middle note, which we should hold. So it can never sound this way. That really amounts to 2/16 and an eighth, which of course isn't correct. And now we come to those famous octaves. Unfortunately, a sort of legend has grown up around them, a myth to the effect that they should be played out of tune and scratchy. Well, I think it's quite possible to play them in a big style and yet not rasp or whistle. Usually the first group we rasp, sound quite rough, and the second group, if we're fortunate, we hear the first note followed by 2 ghosts or 2 whistles. And incidentally, the high B in both cases, whether we use a harmonic or a block string, should not be slid into on this style. We should really hit that square on the nose. All it means is a slight break, a little weight, releasing the finger pressure, and then a quick shift into it, so we have a brilliant note. The good way, or at least a rather useful way, I think, to practice the second group of octaves is this. That's simply taking the first note up bow, the next 2 down bow, and separating everything so our ear grows accustomed to 3 notes. It is really refreshing to hear all 3. Now, turning over the page, we come to this phrase. In all editions, there's a very suspicious-looking swell. In fact, there are 2 swells printed there. They're in the orchestra parts also. The swells, if we exaggerate them, would amount to this. I certainly think they only mean that we should add some warmth to our melody, not in any sense of gush. And unfortunately, you often hear these swells overdone, and then the whole thing seems so exaggerated. A little further along, we come across this. You notice I try to build up each time to the high note, because the orchestra comes in there with some very strong notes. But afterwards, it's perfectly legitimate to relax a little bit, not to try to make the notes brilliant as we go down. Now this all leads into the double stops here, these thirds. This is one of the spots where we have to be very particular about intonation. This often happens. Do you notice the upper finger moves right along with the lower, which of course is not right. We should try to keep that finger, whether it's the second or the first, firmly on the string while the lower finger moves up the half tone, like this. The same sort of thing occurs there. But it's very easy to smear up the whole passage if we allow the fingers to just to be lazy. A few lines further along, after our long G, we come to this tranquillo melody. Notice I was very particular to play only one grace note in this measure. And you hear many a public performance where the violinist, I don't know, through carelessness or why, insists on playing two of them. And to me that brings a sense of flippancy into the music which is really totally foreign to it. So it would sound something like this. Just a flip sound, I think. There's another thing we ought to be rather careful to avoid in this melody. Incidentally, it's marked pianissimo, and of course we have to take the pianissimo with a grain of salt. It's too warm a sound to play that soft. But the slides are very dangerous. This sort of thing happens every day. Just as bad from above or from underneath. And then the length of the eighths in the melody, well, it should be determined by a little heart on our part, but a great many players do this sort of thing with a very square sound. Of course, we should avoid that. And a little further along, we come to these triplets. You'll notice I'm taking these in a very moderate tempo. Not at all, of course, to be misconstrued as a concert tempo. I'm only doing this since we're trying to demonstrate some common errors. There's one right here in our second measure, for instance. And we very often hear performances that sound like this. Sometimes it's due to fingering, sometimes it's simply due to carelessness. A couple of measures further along, where these triplets start, you notice I'm trying to make two melody notes out of the top notes. not just the 1. In all editions, there's an accent on 1 and 3 of each measure. And that sometimes is apt to lead us to do this. And then you hear very little of what goes on in between. And I firmly believe that we need a crescendo there in order to get the feeling of being playful with the notes when they start up high. Incidentally, this is also one of the tests of one's ear for intonation. These notes that F natural, for instance, we often hear this happen. Sort of in between. But if we're satisfied to try if we think of that as melody, I think we get a much more satisfactory reading of it. Now down at the bottom of the page, there's quite a big climax in the orchestra, and we come in answering them as big as we can in this fashion. Since we're struggling to almost offset the orchestra, trying to play as big as we can, I can't see why so many editions, so many editors have come to the conclusion that this is necessary. In other words, it's totally unnecessary to take a new down bow for the A like this. In fact, we lose, I think, the whole dramatic impact, to say nothing of the bad taste. Well, I'll go on to the next portion now. Did you notice I tried desperately not to slide down from the high A again, like on the very first page of the concerto. To me, it simply is a matter of bad taste and another weakness. Of course, it's a very comfortable way to get there, but I think we lose the whole dramatic strength of it in doing anything that weak. Of course, that holds good for both times. Now, over the page, we come to this tranquillo passage. This is a passage that's generally played in a very hasty way by youngsters, shall we say, because the orchestra or the piano has a rather important melody and we're liable to glide over ours with far too little meaning, shall we say. Again, it should be really a singing passage. Now we're going to approach the cadenza. There's one spot I'd like to draw your attention to. In the old editions, that low B, the 8th note I mean, is separated from the whole note like this. And it's a far more sensible way of doing it. We really speak the notes more that way than to try to do them legato. And legato is practically out of the question anyhow. We simply can't make it sound good. Of course, the later ones are, in the old editions, they're all printed legato, but by that time the accompaniment is becoming so big that we sound more or less like broken chords anyhow. Now the 16ths in the cadenza, there are 3 passages going up, and certainly the beginning one we should do with unlimited bravura, I would say. The only thing we should avoid is this. You notice I'm getting my accent on the offbeat note, on the weaker note of the pair, instead of the first one. I know if I were playing it, I'd certainly try to dig in, shall we say, with the bow very much on the first of each pair. Now the second group, if we want to, we can play it brilliantly like the first one, or sometimes it's done in a little more reflective way. But the third time we should certainly make quite a difference. It would seem a little bit out of the picture to try to make a brilliant finish up to that high E. And now we come to the trills. They're really quite a chapter in themselves. First of all, a great many people play the intervals, the trilling intervals, completely wrong to begin with. You often hear performances that, sound sort of subterranean rumblings on this order. You simply can't tell what the intervals are. I think we ought to make it quite clear to ourselves that the top trill, the one on E, has a half tone, not a whole tone. And in the next group of trills, that's a D natural, not D sharp. In the third group, C natural, and then of course a whole tone. After the final trill, we come to a nice chord, and then a C sharp leads to the high E, which of course should be a legato passage upwards. But unfortunately, there are two bad ways of doing it, which are generally the accepted ones. Here they are. Or, either way, as you can hear, is not a very happy solution. I think it's really practically impossible to do the connection thoroughly legato, but at least we can try. If we do something on this style, starting with the one finger and finishing with the other, you notice I try to get into the tempo after we've done a bit of improvising, so to say. I try to get into that tempo only very gradually. I don't know if any of you have heard this particular violinist, but there used to be a very famous European performer who always played the middle of the cadenza in this style. I'm sure any of you will agree with me that that's pretty poor taste. I've even seen people get up and leave the hall when he attempted it. There's a European edition, which we can still get, which has this printed. All of a sudden the up tempo. And I think that's almost as bad taste as the violinist's way of playing, the one I was speaking about. Now let's go on. A little past the next double bar, we come across a triplet figure, and of course there is excitement in the air and all that, but there's simply no reason to race those triplets like they're generally done. First of all, we don't even begin to fill out the bars, and it's a matter of sounding anxious and hurried and all that. Following the triplets, we have this to contend with. You notice I'm trying to play a short note on the beat. Now the comfortable way, which the majority of violinists adopt, is this. Why, I don't know. First of all, the note is printed an eighth. Secondly, it has a very pointed dot above it. And thirdly, it's a pretty bad musical style to make it long. So I don't see why we can't disadopt any style of that sort. Of course, it goes on. try to make them all short. Whether we take them up bow or down bow, that wouldn't matter so much. The main thing is that we don't make a huge accent on them. Now on the final page, there's a printing which is quite confusing. This section it's printed più presto, then a little later it says sempre più presto, and then we finally arrived at a presto. Well, there's a great deal of misleading thought on that, especially among conductors. Some of them have the feeling that it should suddenly go ahead a lot. Others have the feeling that it should suddenly be broader. I think the whole thing is simply a matter of a gradual accelerando into the tempo we're going to use as the final tempo, in other words, the final presto. After that, we might possibly go ahead towards the end, but certainly for the moment we have to hold a little bit firm. And all of the accents, the sforzandi, they look pretty square and they look pretty ferocious and all that, but we should really lead into them. So they never sound, so that in the height of the battle they remain lyrical. At the end, before we go up to the high B, we have this. There's another case of perhaps using a little comfort to get up there, but musically it'd be very bad. In other words, we should not take our time. Rather, make a bold bid for it, and if we miss it, I'm speaking of in practicing, of course, if we miss it, we simply do the measuring over again, like Signor Paganini is supposed to have done a great many times when people heard him practicing. After the B, we go on with some quite quick eighths, of course, and one of the customary, well, I won't say traditions, but one of the customary examples that violinists set is this. In other words, either to play a wrong note or play the G so high that it's very suspicious. Perhaps it comes from because we had a high D sharp here. It takes a lot of quick manipulating to get that fourth finger down low enough. My feeling is that the tempo we finally arrive at for the presto in the second movement, the andante, there's generally quite a discussion about the tempo. I don't think it matters too much exactly the metronomic speed we take it, but the thing that does matter is that a great deal of the movement should be played with a sort of exalted simplicity, and that can be very, very moving. By simplicity, I don't mean dryness, of course, because there's too much poetry in it for that. There are a great many spots which are quite soaring, they're quite celestial, and we ought to try to summon out an ethereal tone to meet that. The choice of vibrato for our opening solo, of course, will depend on the personality of the player, but we certainly should not turn it into a wide, beery sound. It can be very pure, it can be very sweet, it has to sing, but a wide vibrato is rather to be avoided, I'd say. My idea of the opening tempo would be something like this. There are several ways of approaching the A on the A string. One of the customary ones is this. certainly can't see the necessity for that gushiness in this particular spot. Another popular version is this. Again, I feel that's simply a safety first measure, that old-fashioned sound which is not very inspired. There's a way that's sometimes adopted which might be helpful, and that's this. We think of a grace note, but we don't play it. In other words, there's a tiny space there. The thing we should avoid is for it to sound a square jump or a gushy jump. Either way, we lose the entire spirit of the passage. In the middle section of the movement, we come to this. You notice I try very hard to sustain that melody on the E string. And a great many violinists do this, which of course is absurd. Musically, the important line is the melody above that slow tremolo. And that should be continued at all costs. It's rather difficult, of course, to avoid this. But the poor E should shine through, the same as all the quarters should. At the end of that section, when we return to the beginning melody, there's a tricky little thing that will cause us trouble. I don't know if you noticed or not, but I try to come from the F sharp to the F natural, not from D. That's part of the slow tremolo, not from that note up to the F. It's again a very nice, safe way to get there, but the melody, of course, goes on this way. It just simply continues on down to the E. So if we can do this, it means returning the bow, so to say, to the E string after our final 32nd D. Towards the end of the movement, we have a passage in sixteenths mostly, in which there are a few grace notes. Sometimes there are two, sometimes there is only one. And again, like those spots in the first movement, I think we should observe what is printed. In other words, two when there are two, one when there is one. I think we quite often forget that grace notes were intended to grace the notes, to beautify them, and not to serve as stumbling blocks, not only in this particular spot, but there are many others in our literature where that is true. At the very end of the movement, there are three of these grace notes that come before a C, and they're printed on the other side, in other words, on the right side of the bar line. So many violinists take it for granted that they should play the B on the C major chord, which makes a totally unexpected discord, and I don't think it's necessary at all. I think it's a matter of taking our time over the grace notes so there's no agitation there, and not trying to put them on the beat. They should come on the other side of the bar line, the left side. Well, let's proceed on to the Allegro molto vivace, the last movement of the concerto. This is the movement which, well, causes a good deal of discussion, to say the least, as far as the tempo goes. Generally, the soloist is accused of playing it entirely too fast. And on the other hand, when he tries to hold himself in, make a square performance of it, it sounds so childlike and impossible that it's not enjoyable at all. As a matter of fact, the movement is really a sunny scherzo, and you could have lifted the music bodily from the Midsummer Night's Dream, I believe. And whatever the tempo played, there's a vast difference between fast and hurried and between fast and controlled. And I believe that if one plays it in a fairly lively tempo but controlled, we get all of the joy out of it. It's brilliant. It's a happy sound. Leading into this Allegro molto, though, is the short bridge from the Andante, an allegretto, which goes like this. You'll notice I'm rather particular about separating all the notes which are repeated, because one of the general faults in playing this passage is this. That gush which creeps in on the second up bow note. And I feel that the notes should be all well understood, well pronounced. In this bowing here, it's printed this way in the score. The note which you hear a little strong is the up bow, but of course any competent orchestra player would slur the whole half measure like this. He gets the same slight articulation that way at easier cost than taking a separate bow. Let's return to the Allegro molto vivace. I'm going to play a couple of the orchestra voices before the solo notes come in. It's difficult to play those sixteenths in the solo part with a sense of happiness. To be funny, they must be jolly. They must be perhaps a little dashing. We can't afford to be too appealing and sound like a kitten begging for milk there. There's hardly time to do it. I think the most successful way of practicing the little passage is probably this. That's to cling to the 4th 16th before we make our upward way towards the A harmonic, which of course we always hope to hit, but at the same time it means that we have to keep the finger on the string until we arrive at that spot. Now comes the pièce de résistance, or to renew an old pun, the piece of resistance, because these notes certainly resist the violinist's inclination not to hurry. They just love to go faster and faster. That's one of the reasons we get accused of hurrying the whole movement. There's one thing I'd like to point out before I play the passage, and that is that on the second quarter of each measure where this rhythm occurs, there's an 8th note which should be short. And a great many of our violinists who have plenty of musical ideas otherwise, certainly commit something against poor Mr. Mendelssohn when they insist upon holding that second eighth in the measure like this. I'm exaggerating, of course, but we certainly must lift the bow off before we take the first up bow short note. See what I'm trying to do? The other way, it puts a false weight on the weak part of the measure, on the second beat. Another thing which often occurs is that we try to make the eighths, which we take in one bow, of course, we try to make those all a little too short. And in a hall, they sound more like whistles, something very sharp, than they do like notes. But if we can take just a little more spread with the bow, as much as we can do in the quick tempo, we have better luck. A measure or two later, we come across this. I feel that that is no place to celebrate with some long, juicy B's on this style. First of all, we lose half of the joy. It's supposed to be a happy movement, and that way we certainly pin our wings down to the ground. Now the first passage in sixteenths generally is done this way. Now there we are back again, and poor people in the hall or even in a room have heard nothing at all. It's a matter of gluing ourselves to the string as far as our fingers go, and simply making ourselves hold back. A couple of measures later, we come across this little figure. And one of the most absurd fingerings, I think, is this old-fashioned way of going up to the third position, coming down, going up, coming down. We get this sound. I think you'll agree with me that doesn't sound very much like a scherzo. It's very easy to remain in the first position. Makes it a little more difficult for the bow, but nothing to speak of. Or we can take the 16ths first pair already in the second position. And that makes it come only in one position, but on two strings instead of three. Another favorite spot for out-of-tune playing is the following group of 16ths. We generally hear this. The D sharp is generally about halfway between. Something like that. I believe we could conquer this very quickly if we'd have the patience to simply play very slowly a high first finger on D sharp and a low first finger on A. In some editions, of course, you come across this fingering. And that's another safety measure, I believe. If one ever adopted that, he would certainly have to make a little articulation with the bow between A and C sharp on this order, because it would be a very bad sort of taste which would allow us to do that. Now the following eighths, going on down to the B on the A string, you notice those grace notes I try to play very late, practically on the beat. Otherwise they sound very clumsy. And the final B is also a favorite stopping point for many violinists. They do this. Why, I don't know. Perhaps of the difficulty of making a short note on a down bow, it might be that. So in that case, why don't we simply do it up bow, even if it means taking two notes together up bow. Then we achieve the lightness we should have. Now as we go on, notice I slur those two pairs of notes together. I have an old score, at least a rather old score, before me here. It was printed about 65 years ago in Germany, and I believe it's fairly authentic. And in that score, both of those pairs of eights are slurred. Some of our solo violinists play the entire passage, of course, unslurred, everything separately. Others do the slurs I just played for you like this. It's really a matter of personal taste, I think. Now come the 16ths, which are the Waterloo of many a performance. We're left all alone there. We hurry along, we scramble along, and all of a sudden comes a very big explosive pizzicato chord in the orchestra, which we can't begin to match with any sort of strength. There are very few violinists who are able to control these notes and play them evenly and yet brilliantly. It's a matter of our fingers running together just at the wrong times. By the way, this figure is very often mistreated too. They either play the 16th practically as 30 seconds, or they play them so squarely that there's no joy in it at all. I believe it is the case where we should sort of take the halfway path in between 16ths and 30 seconds. Then we get a happy sound out of the notes. A few lines further down the page, we come to this passage in the 16th. A great many ingenious and clever fingerings have been devised for this passage, but whichever we may choose to use, we still do have to change positions, even though in some fingerings it's fewer times than others. And here and there'll be a shift which we have to do very lightly, very quickly, at the last second, something on this order. Certainly not this. I don't believe we should ever start Wednesday's note on Tuesday. After the next tutti, there's a short 8-bar tutti, which is supposed to be a rhythm which guides us. We come in. Our rhythm certainly should be very incisive, and as to what degree we put on the brakes, that'll depend on how fast the tutti went just before we come in. But there should certainly be no sense of hurrying, and certainly no accents of this sort. I don't know why it is, one is always so tempted on those up bows. It's a case of getting near the frog and oh how I love me, I suppose, that makes us do this. On the next page, we come across this nice heartwarming melody. But now our troubles begin. We have the filigree work now continuing, and the orchestra has this rich melody underneath. But usually the soloist continues on at breakneck speed, not listening one bit to what goes on in the background, and once in a while a romantically inclined conductor will suddenly discover a great festival of sound and proceed to dawdle over the melody while we hurry on. It's one of the spots where more upsets occur, I believe, than any one particular spot in the whole concerto. I've heard performances where the soloist ended up at least a half a measure ahead of the orchestra. But there is always a way of compromising. One can sing the orchestra part without actually holding back, and we should certainly pay attention to what's going on and do our part in a sunny way without hurrying. 3 or 4 lines further along, we come across the passage which has caused a lot of trouble. where we have all of these eighths in one bow. In various editions you come across different sorts of editings. Some will put 4 notes in one bow, some will put 8. Others advise you to do the whole passage in single bows. But from our standpoint, it's much more effective if we can do the whole batch of notes in one up bow like it's printed. There's a little exercise I'd suggest there, and that is this. Now these are all up bow notes. I'm going back a little bit, of course, for each single one, and each time I'm going back a little bit further with the arm, so that by the time we arrive at the end, we're at the extreme point of the bow. That's something, of course, we would not do in a performance, but it will be helpful in seeing that we don't crowd ourselves and arrive at the frog too early. So it's this. We're going back, we're going back, we're going back. Now, I'm already at the extreme point, which of course is very uncomfortable. But when you play it in a quick concert tempo, then it's much easier. On the next page, we have this melody. The last few eighth notes of that melody have the word semplice underneath. In other words, simply. But that doesn't preclude our playing them with a certain charm, I hope. And it's also a very good spot to avoid unnecessarily long slides. For instance, this sort. It's rather sickening, and this type is almost worse. The 16ths, which follow, are supposed to be light and gay, of course, but we don't often have the pleasure of doing them that way. First of all, because the general performance you hear is a so-called workmanlike one. In other words, we glue ourselves down to the fingerboard and play for dear life. And on the other hand, the accompaniment, whether it be orchestral or piano, is generally too heavy and too clumsy. Heavy in tone and clumsy in rhythm. It should be really very light, so that we all work together. It's again a case of it sounding like a scherzo, not like a heavy march. These 16ths laid into these broken chords. You'll notice that the harmony changes don't occur on the beat. I'll do this very slowly. You notice the A sharp down below and the B sharp up above. They hardly ever come in the right spots when you hear the work in public. Now, as for the chords, some violinists prefer to arrange their bowing so they'll all come down bow. They're probably used to playing most chords down bow. Others take them down, up. It wouldn't matter too much, except that the last 3 chords have only G naturals in. There's no G sharp. And it's a common mistake to hear this. Of course, that's a deadly mistake. There's no G sharp in that whole measure. They're all 3 G naturals. So they should sound like this. On the last page of the concerto, there is a 16th passage which begins like this. The notes are printed this way. I'll do them quite slowly. They are not intended this way. You notice I changed 1/16 too early. That's also a common fault. if you'll just check up on that. I try to practice it this way. I make myself wait before that 4th 16th to be sure of it. Well, about this time, when our right arm is possibly all tired out, we're expected to summon all the possible energy we have to make a real compelling finish with a sort of blazing enthusiasm. Now, that unfriendly gesture on the part of some of the composers occurs in a great many concertos of our repertoire. The Beethoven, the Tchaikovsky, the Bruch D minor, the Prokofiev G minor, to name just a few. Those accents are really genuine accents. They're honest-to-goodness accents. In the earlier similar passage, we can, we imitate a mandolin, because those are crescendi and diminuendi. This time, we're really doing, I was going to say fierce accents, really, against a strong orchestral background. So we have to cut through. On the very final line of our concerto, the chords are very liable to go entirely wrong if we don't block the A string with a B, a second finger B, like this. Otherwise, we're apt to get this, which of course would not fit into the harmony by any means. So it wouldn't be a crime if we simply play that B right along with the other double stops. Most violinists do, on that style. In summarizing what we have touched on in the concerto, I would say that 3 of the most important things to consider for one studying the work would be the utmost care with intonation in general, to see that the fingers don't run away in fast passage work, and to always seek beauty of tone. It is, of course, extremely important, in fact a necessity, that the player acquaints himself thoroughly with the score. In that way, he gains an understanding of the work as a whole.